Thank you.
Hola, buenas noches. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Muchas gracias también a Vivian Gornick por acompañarnos. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's a
pleasure.
Ha tenido un día maratoniano. No ha parado de responder a periodistas y está agotada, pero tenía muchas ganas de estar aquí y de contarnos cosas. Si estáis aquí, imagino que ella ya no necesita mucha presentación, pero bueno, de todos modos, por si hay alguien que ha venido por curiosidad, lo que sea, solo deciros que Vivian Gornick empezó en el mundo del periodismo, en Village Voice, en los años 70, es cuando ella también descubrió el feminismo. Era también una crítica literaria muy temida, porque es una crítica literaria muy dura, y es muy reconocida por sus ensayos también. Aunque a ella lo que le gusta, ella ha publicado varios libros de memorias y le gusta más hablar de narrativa personal. Aquí hemos podido leerla en dos libros que ha publicado Sexto Piso. Primero fueron Apegos Feroces, que son unas memorias que escribió en el año 87, y después llegó La mujer singular en la ciudad, que se publicó en 2015. En estos libros nos habla de muchísimas cosas que van a ser pues, objeto de la conversación ahora con ella, de la relación con su madre, una relación bastante particular, si habéis leído Apegos Feroces lo sabéis, de su vida en el Bronx, de la ciudad, de la creación, de la escritura, del feminismo.
The Bronx, I understood that.
Yeah. Le he contado primero lo que iba a decir y en principio está de acuerdo con todo, o sea que estamos bien. Y bueno, no me voy a enrollar más porque en realidad queremos escucharla a ella. And Vivian, your mother expected you to be a teacher.
Yes.
Instead, you... Sorry. Thank you.
Yes, when I was a girl, if a girl went to college, she walked in one door marked college and came out another door marked teacher. And my mother thought that I would be a teacher. When I got out of school and she discovered I wasn't a teacher, she felt swindled. She felt I had swindled her, yes. That was what girls were supposed to be, teachers.
Instead, you became a journalist?
Instead, I became a journalist.
At the Village Voice?
At the Village Voice.
But not only a journalist, but a polemicist journalist?
Yes.
And a feminist journalist?
Indeed, the two came together at once. I got hired by the Village Voice, and it was the exact moment when feminism was breaking in New York.
This was in the 70s?
It was 1970.
1970?
Exactly 1970. And I went out to interview a whole lot of women who became famous in later years. Kate Millett, Susan Brown Miller, T. Grace Atkinson, Betty Friedan, all kinds of women who were just early feminists. And I came back converted. Right. I went out a journalist and I came back a convert. And I wrote a piece that was much anthologized in later years, called The Next Great Moment in History is Theirs.
And I think you started seeing sexism everywhere?
I started seeing it everywhere. I did indeed, everywhere. Yes, the Village Voice was a newspaper. I'm going to address that.
Yes,
okay?
of course. Yeah.
The Village Voice was a newspaper of opinion. It was an important newspaper in the counterculture of the 1970s. So it was a kind of newspaper where writers all had opinions. That's all we had. We had no facts, we only had opinions. We were journalists of that sort. It was that kind of time. It was also a somewhat repressive time, and just to be liberal was to be radical. So many of us who worked at the Village Voice were really just liberals. I turned out a radical feminist, but mostly they were liberals, but just to open your mouth and speak openly about a whole number of things seemed very radical. So that when I went out and interviewed all these feminists and came back a feminist myself, it was fine with the newspaper. You know, that was the kind of thing that they loved. And so I became that kind of a journalist that was, in other words, being a polemicist, being on the barricades for radical feminism, taught me the value of a point of view. And in later life, it was very useful to me when, as a writer of what I hoped was literature rather than pamphleteering, I had learned to value the meaning of having a strong point of view, and that was going to direct a lot of my future writing.
I think you say that having a point of view can make the difference between literature or not.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Yes, a point of view in literature is very important. Yeah. Yes, I do. I do think so.
You became a really active feminist.
Yes.
And time has passed, and I think at that time you thought that maybe it would take a few years to get better, but I don't know if you expected that we would need so many years to get better.
It's been a big shock. Yes, indeed, as Anna is saying, we were of that generation. We thought what we see today in our hundreds will surely be seen tomorrow in their thousands, and the day after that, a few million, and the revolution will be accomplished. And here we are 50 years later with nowhere near, with a great deal of change, an immense amount of change, immense. But the revolution is hardly accomplished. Right. And I was a child of the left. My parents were on the left. I grew up in a communist household. And so I was taught, well, two things at once. I was taught also the revolution is around the corner. And on the other hand, that was the class revolution, right? The revolution against capitalism was around the corner. And at the same time, taught to take the long view. You know, and it was the same with me with feminism. At first, I thought change will occur very rapidly because there was so much justice in our cause. And then I began to see that it was a matter of social change, which had to do with changing the emotional habits of a few thousand years. So it wasn't going to be so simple. And then I became devoted to the idea of the slowness of social change, that it had to do more with converting people's minds. Women, first and foremost, more than men, that more women had to come to see their own condition more accurately than they did. And I trusted, and indeed that is what has happened. I mean, over these decades, I mean, look how many years. It's 50 years since we coined the term sexual harassment. 50 years, and nowhere near enough progress on that score. And that's why women are so more angry today than they have been in the last years. But it's a measure of the slowness of social change. So the anger is the double-sided sword. It's a double-edged sword. But it's perfectly understandable, and I have to say I endorse it because I take it as part of taking the long view.
I think you're not particularly optimistic, but that you are quite optimistic on that subject.
Yeah, yes, both at once. Yeah, I've never been pessimistic. I have never felt that we weren't making progress. I've been shocked and disappointed, of course, like everybody else, that it's so slow and there's so much backlash when there is. But I see it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And even now, with the anger of the Me Too movement and the way it has spread throughout the world, I still know only a small amount of change is going to come out of it. But if a few thousand men, including the boy that you're carrying,
he will be a feminist.
He will be a feminist. If a few thousand men come out of this growing up differently than they would have otherwise, that will be good enough. That's all I expect.
Yeah. I read in an interview that you said that being a woman has always been the most important part for you of your identity.
Yes, by which I meant I happen to embody 3 elements of marginalized identity. I was born into the immigrant working class, Jewish, and a woman. 3 unwanted elements. But I've come to feel being a woman was the most important of all those three. The other two were more malleable. The other two gave much more, especially in the United States. Being born into the working class, as an immigrant, being born into the immigrant working class did not mean terrible consequences. It did not mean you could not rise out of it, which of course I did, and get an education and become many different things, which we all did. And being Jewish in the United States was not either, by my generation, not a punishment, as it had been for my parents. It wasn't a punishment. But being a woman never stopped being a punishment. So I did consider that the most important part of feeling an outsider. By the time I came to understand feminism, I was already a practiced outsider. I'd had, in other words, a lot of time to think about the meaning of being inside or outside, being at the margin or being at the center, of being wanted and not being unwanted. And my generation, as I've said before today, my generation of feminists were very philosophically minded, existentially minded. We were a generation who made large sense out of what we saw happening to us, because we were the first generation to really take this large historical view and to see ourselves in history more than in the immediate, just in the immediate. You know what I mean? I mean, I never knew anyone for whom equal pay for equal work was the primary, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That wasn't the first thing that impressed us. It was important, but it were two ways of doing politics. Okay. Either the very practical, on the ground, legislative and rallies and meetings, or seeing it in a large way throughout history, and seeing that we took our place in an endless history of aggression, of one set of human beings aggressing against another. And men and women were just one of those elements. But for me, it became the most powerful, and so it became my cause. Mm-hmm. So all those other things were good practice for getting there.
And this has always accompanied you when you were a journalist. You were a feminist journalist.
Yeah.
But then you started writing, not journalism, because I think you were tired of talking about the world, and you wanted to start talking a little bit about you. What was inside you?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Yes, I was a journalist for a long time, and I loved doing that. But slowly, they came upon me the desire. I saw myself as a stranger in other people's lives as a journalist, as you are. And I saw myself that way, and it began to become unsatisfying. I felt a growing need to write, to tell stories, to do another kind of writing. And when that need grew strong enough, I turned to what felt like the most natural material, and that was the story that I always had it in me to tell about my mother, myself, and a woman who lived next door to me when I was a child, and how these two women between them made me a woman. By that time, I already knew that was a story that I could tell and that I wanted to tell.
But I think you started writing it, but then after 40 pages or so, you got stuck.
Yeah, oh, you know more than I do already. Yes, okay. Yes. I started to tell the story as though it were in the past, to tell the story of living in this tenement building in the Bronx, this working class neighborhood in the Bronx, and all the women, mostly the women who lived in this building, I started to tell it that way, and then I realized I had a lot of unfinished business with my mother, and I didn't know how to include it, you know. And then one day, my mother called me and told me a story that had just happened on the street. She was crossing the street, and a little girl was standing next to her, a little kid about 7 or 8 years old, and this little girl started to cross the street on the red light. My mother pulled her back and said, "Sweetheart, you only cross on the green." And this kid looked at my mother and she said, "Lady, you got the whole thing upside down." And my mother said to me, "That kid's not going to live to be 8 years old." Yeah. And it was very funny. So I thought yes, because as Anna says, I got stuck. I didn't know how to go forward. And for months, I didn't know what to do. So when my mother told me this story, I sat down and I said to myself, I'm going to write this out. Just going to write out this little story. But in order to write it out and have it mean something, I had to set it up. I had to tell how my mother and I walk all the time, and there are all these stories that take place on the streets of New York between her and me and what happens on the street. That's what a writer calls setting it up in order to give it strength, in order to make the punchline really count. So I did that. And when I was finished, I realized I had goals. I had the structure for a book in which I could tell the story from the back and I could tell the story from the present. So that now I restructured the whole thing so that I told parts of what happened when I was a child, and then I would revert to my mother and I walking on the street in New York. And in the goodness of time, I realized these two sets of women were accounting for themselves to each other. And then I had the book. So that I knew that I had to write then I rewrote everything I'd written to make that work. And that was structure. And that gave me the story that I needed. So that by the end of the book, when I bring it up to date, I know I accomplished that. I did exactly that. By the time the book ends, and I, the grown-up Vivian, and my mother are facing each other, the people from the past are impacted on them. Mm-hmm. I never had it so good again. I never found the perfect structure again. So, of course, it's my favorite book.
It's your favorite book? It's your favorite book?
Yes, it is. Actually, I'd never read the book until the other day, a couple of months ago, after I wrote. I never read it from that day to this.
Really?
Yeah. And I read it and I was shocked at how good it is.
And what made you read it?
I never wrote another book as good. I really do, yeah.
And what made you read it 2 months ago?
Because I was coming here.
Because you were, okay.
Yeah, and because
you knew we would be asking things
yes,
about the book?
I thought, what are they so excited about?
And now you understand.
I think I do. Yes, I've been amazed, actually, how Europe has suddenly discovered me after 30 years after the book was written. And that it's been published in, as I think I told you, in like 7 or 8 countries this past year and a half. And I really don't understand what it's all about, but I'm very grateful.
And can I ask you if your mother found the book so amazing?
My mother. My mother was alive, of course, and read the book. Yeah, every other day she loved it. Every other day. On the other day, she hated it. She was very volatile. She was a very childish woman and very volatile. One day she would say, "You just told the truth." The next day she would say, "You've held me up to ridicule. Now the whole world knows you hate me." She was, yeah. But the book actually had a lot of celebrity in New York when it was published. And my mother started to walk around the city signing it.
Oh, she was signing the book.
And I said to her, "Ma, you can't sign this book. You didn't write it." And she said, "Well, without me, there was no book." So I couldn't argue with her.
Yeah, she
so
was
it was
right
a joke.
at some point.
Yeah.
She was right.
She was right, yeah. It was very hard for her. She said very often it was painful. But she had enough integrity to not blame me for it. She knew that I was never setting out to trash her. I was never setting out to make her look bad. I was always setting out to tell hard truth. That's all. I did not want to make myself look good and her look bad. Never. And that was of primary importance. Because I knew that would be bad writing. Bad. So she felt that. She felt that I was trying to be truthful and be loyal to the very title, Fierce Attachments, that it was a fierce attachment. And she had the integrity to realize that.
I think when you write about people who, of course, existed, honesty is really important for you.
I think, absolutely. Because it's only through honesty in this kind of writing that you can make the writing good. It's not a moral position. It's really, really, truly, it's a functional position as a writer. Because in nonfiction writing, the narrator must be reliable. In fictional writing, you can have an unreliable narrator, somebody who's lying, for instance, and the lying is part of the story.
Okay.
But not in nonfiction writing. It won't work. Because then if the reader cannot trust that the narrator is really, truly struggling to get to the truth, not to necessarily get there, but that the effort is legitimate, that the writer is really struggling. You know, you read lots and lots of writers who are racists, sexist, all kinds of terrible things. But if you can feel, George Orwell is one of those writers, the English writer George Orwell, if you can feel the honesty, what you do with him, if you can feel him really engaging with the situation and struggling to understand what's happening, you give him everything. If you don't, nothing. So that was why I've always known I could never make myself look good at the expense of my subject. I could never give myself... And there's an American writer named Lillian Hellman. She was a playwright. She had a lot of fame in my girlhood and beyond. And she had a habit of writing in a kind of mythical, poetic way. And wrote in the first person, a number of memoirs in the first person that sounded very poetic. And when I was a girl, I thought they were very honest. When I grew up and grew older and read them, I saw the dishonesty lay in the fact that she always came out looking good and everybody else came out looking a lot less good. She seemed to be the only honest person in the room, and I knew that that was false. And then I taught writing, and I had students who read this book many, many years after she was dead. They didn't know who she was, they didn't know what it was all about, but they knew immediately, instinctively, that this was a dishonest story that was being told. And that was how they knew it, you know, because she looked good at the expense of others, and it just won't work.
And
remember that.
And was it difficult for you to write the book? Such a
Fierce Attachments?
Yes.
No.
No?
Well, it was difficult in the sense that all writing is difficult, but
I think you even consider writing an agony, not just something difficult.
say again?
An agony?
Agony.
I think sometimes you use the word agony to describe writing.
Oh, yes. Oh, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It really is, yeah.
But in the case of fierce attachment, yes, it is. It's the hardest thing in the world to think.
Yeah?
The hardest. Harder than digging ditches.
It still is? Or does
Yeah,
it get
always.
better?
No.
No? Sorry.
Me too. Yeah, no.
But
no,
you
it never
still
gets
do
better.
It.
Well, yes. Well, yes. I mean, yeah. When it goes well, there's nothing in the world like it. Nothing can touch it. There's not, and I love you in the world. That's better than writing well. So yes, no, it's what I do. It's what I do. But it's difficult. But with the case of fierce attachments, it was an experience I felt I had completely under control. I felt I stood in the middle of it, and I could look all around, and I understood it all. And I've never had that feeling since. With everything else, I've struggled differently to understand what I was doing. But with that, I knew who was speaking. I knew who was speaking, and therefore I knew why she was speaking.
Because when reading the book, you feel that it's really honest. You feel
good.
like this intimacy between you and your mother, and I was wondering if it didn't bother you to show us this.
You mean what? The reality
Yes,
between me and my mother?
to expose your feelings and so that we know about your relationship.
Well, as I said before, I trusted my motive. I knew that I was not setting out to make her bad and me good. I was setting out to describe as honestly as I could this relationship because I thought I had found meaning in it that merited writing about it, right? However, as we've already established, my mother was alive, and she would every other day she would say to me, "Why are you writing this? Why?" She knew what I was doing. I had told her because I was afraid not to. Mm-hmm. And she would attack me constantly. Why was I doing this? And when she did, it would paralyze me, and I would not be able to work for days at a time. And then I would recall that this was my experience, not hers, and she didn't have the right to dictate to me. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I discovered that as a writer is exactly what you have to have the courage to do that. And I guess it is courage. I guess it is, because you're called to account by people who are alive and people who will be hurt, potentially. But when you forget their existence, I used to know a writer who said, she was a novelist, but she said, "I write as if everyone was dead." You know, as if everyone is dead, nobody can
complain.
Nobody can complain. There is that. It's inescapable. There isn't a writer in the world who doesn't suffer from this kind of consideration. There are people who are going to hold you to account. There are people who are not going to like you. There are people who are going to deny what you say, and you have to ignore it all. And if you can't, you're not a writer. And if you can, you're right. Mm-hmm. It's really that simple. Mm-hmm. So you know, there's no. In a way, there's no point in saying to a writer, "How can you do this or that?" You know, the fact that you do it demonstrates who you are and what the relation is.
Mm-hmm. I think it's in The Odd Woman and the City. There's a moment when you talk about writing one day that you are really happy because you can't stop writing and everything sounds good, and you talk about a rectangle.
Yes.
Could you please tell us a little bit about that, the idea?
When I was much younger, I used to feel often that, I don't even remember what I wrote. I used to feel often that I was like hollowed out, right? And that it was inside that space that I wrote, that I worked. I can't even remember exactly what the image was. That when I lost faith in myself, I would feel as if that space was narrowing, as if the rectangle was closing. It was just an image that came to me. And actually, I don't know if it's legal for me to say this. This image arose under marijuana. When I was very young. I once had a really bad marijuana experience in which that gave birth to that image. I was sure I was going to die. I thought the walls of that rectangle were closing, and when they met, I would be dead. But I actually came to feel that way about writing. It was just a melodramatic image of a very young woman who felt very insecure and struggled against that insecurity. Struggled immensely for a long, long time against that insecurity. I forgot all about that.
And do you think that part of that insecurity comes from the relationship you had with your mother?
No, I think insecurity comes with everything, from everything.
From everything?
Yeah, I think, yes, human beings are born insecure. Very few are born self-assured. Oh, yes, of course, insecurity comes from everything. I mean, you know, the earliest, when I became a feminist, I did become persuaded that a great deal of my insecurity came from having been born a little girl in a household. I had a brother where the brother was held in high regard, and I felt, before I could even say the words, that I felt I was not born in, that I was not held in anywhere near the same regard as he was. and that it was taken for granted that he was a genius, which he wasn't, and that and not much attention was paid to my mind, which I thought was as good. Well, I don't know what I thought, but I certainly felt the anxiety, the insecurity that somebody feels when she feels her mind ignored. And I did, when I was a very young feminist, I was useful to me to feel that I felt that way because I was a girl. And that was probably true. I mean, and no doubt, not probably, it was true. That that in that household, and my parents were perfectly decent. They were perfectly decent people, more than perfectly decent. Mm-hmm. But it was also true at the same time that what I absorbed was this on-automatic attention paid to him, and in the same way, whatever it was they held me in regard for, it wasn't my mind. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, when I was quite young, it was the only thing that really mattered to me. Yeah, which was surprising. Mm-hmm. The rest never mattered that much. Mm-hmm. Many girls grow up wanting to be beautiful, wanting to be held, have great sexual popularity, feel glamorous, and that was one of girls. I wanted to be the most glamorous woman in the room. I wanted to be the smartest person in the room. Mm-hmm. And I did not grow up in a place where I felt that was a possibility. And I'm sure being a girl contributed greatly to that.
Mm-hmm. I think your mother's first concern was that you found love, which
Absolutely.
is the most
That's
important
all I ever
thing
heard.
in a
Love is the most important thing in a woman's life. Don't you believe it? Work is the most important thing in a woman's life. Yes. My mother thought I should go to college because a girl should always have a trade. In case her husband died or left her, she would be able to make a living. That's why a girl should have an education. You're laughing. I think it sounds like you felt the same. Yes, that's how I was raised, that we should get an education just in order, as a safety valve against the husband not coming through. Love was the most important thing in a woman's life. I heard that every day of my life. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you believe it at some point? I think were you waiting for
well, I'm sure I
Prince
believed
Charming
it.
at the
It
beginning?
made me anxious. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very young. Because I remember feeling as a teenager, how will I know if I'm really in love? What's the mark? How will I know? And I always felt, I won't know. I'll miss it. Everybody else will know, but I'll miss it.
Mm-hmm. And you married twice?
I married twice.
But it didn't work.
Say again?
But it didn't work.
No, it didn't work. I will say I married in bad faith. Mm-hmm. I never really believed in what I was doing. I was always very anxious. And I discovered early I hated being called Mrs. Mm. I didn't want to be called Miss. I'm laughing now. I guess I really I didn't know what I was doing. That's more important than anything else. I married never really knowing what I was doing, but convinced a girl had to be married. I mean, you had to be married. So as a very young woman, I was convinced that I had work in me to do. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had work in me to do, but also that I wouldn't be able to do it until I had the right partner. Now that's a mark of my generation, by the way. You know the English writer Doris Lessing? Does everybody know that? Yeah. So Lessing was like 20 years older than me. So her generation taught mine, and in hers, she identified her own generation as a struggle to become free women. But she also established in the Golden Notebook, her great book, the terrible struggle that a woman like that had to reconcile love and work. That was what we got from it. So I was still imbued with that there was a strong relation. And the great thing about that book is it's practically encyclopedic in what it tells us about what it was to be a grown-up woman in the 1950s who did not primarily want to be a wife and mother. Right? And in that book, she is many things. She's a working communist, for one thing. She's very, very political. She's got all these women, these fractured images of the same woman. The Golden Notebook is one notebook of many notebooks. The red, the blue, they're all the same woman, with given different names and different aspects of a struggle for identity, right? Mm-hmm. And this woman is many, many different things, but she herself doesn't believe in any of them. She goes to work in Communist Party headquarters. She has lovers. She travels. She writes. She does all kinds of things, but she can't pull herself together. And the reason she can't pull herself together is she can't find the right guy to make her cohere. So that was what I got. We read it. I read it at 21, and that's what I got from it was I must work. I must do important work I thought was important, but I could only do it when I found the right partner. So that's how the generations work. And then until finally, in my maturity and that of all the other women of my generation who became feminists, we suddenly said, no, not that love is negligible, but the world is not well lost for love. Because if you give up the world for love, you give up yourself, whatever you are, whatever struggle you have to know who you are, it just won't work. It isn't that you don't want to love, and it isn't that domestic tranquility is not important, and domestic relations, and having, being a mother and all the rest of it. It isn't that those things aren't important, but they're not the most important. The most important is, I believe, to know yourself through the efforts of your own mind and spirit and force of being, and that, wherever the chips fall, let them fall. Whichever way things turn out, they turn out. But to become centered in yourself, in whatever way that matters, I mean, that's really what we fought for. That's what women's rights, to a large degree, should give us. The struggle for women's rights is just literally that, the struggle for women's rights. It's the struggle for equality as a citizen, as a citizen of the world, the struggle for social, political, cultural equality. That every girl and every boy are born into a world in which it's fully expected that whatever your sex is, you will experience your life as fully as you can. That whatever holds you back, it will not be through politics. It will not be through the inequality of the laws or the customs or the expectations. That's what women's rights is all about, nothing else. Beyond that, the meaning, it was that struggle allowed you to think about what the meaning of experiencing yourself was. In the name of what do we want these rights, which are basic human rights? That's all it is, it's the struggle for basic human rights. But then you went further and you thought, in the name of what? And it is to struggle to become as much of a whole human being as you can. Nobody ever completes that. But the struggle is worth everything. And if you subordinate yourself to, in the sense of looking upon being a mother and a wife as your profession, as your identity, you do yourself a disservice. Every man in the world who is worth anything wants to be a husband and a father. Those are very human things. But no man ever wanted to identify himself as a husband and a father. And by the same token, we believe no woman should identify herself. That's not the major identity. Those are things that just come along with living a full life. But that's not who you are, fundamentally. So Freud, the great Freud, said life is work and love, in that order. And that's what I spent the rest of my life saying. Work and love. If you don't have either one, It's a huge loss. It's a huge deprivation. It's far from an ideal life. But if you have to give up one of them, don't give up work. I'm really just joking, you know that. Oh, no, I mean it seriously, but at the same time, I'm sort of joking.
Vivian, there is this word that you understood from my introduction, which was Bronx.
The Bronx,
The Bronx.
right.
We're seeing a few pictures
look at that.
of the Bronx and Manhattan
Yes.
around the 50s and 60s.
Is that Times Square? No. Oh, well,
I couldn't
that's Manhattan.
recognize it. Yeah.
Yeah, the great city. Yeah.
You've always lived in New York, but when you were in the Bronx, you had the impression that there was like
I
this
was living in
big
Kansas.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, well, you know, for New Yorkers, Manhattan was Araby. Manhattan is the center. Manhattan is the center. It's where you wanted to go when you grew up and were going to make your mark in the world. The Bronx and all of the boroughs, the Queens, Bronx, and Brooklyn, all of those boroughs are filled with huge amounts of working class neighborhoods. All the immigrants were in all of those boroughs. So for all of us growing up, you wanted to get out of there and you wanted to get to Manhattan. Manhattan was Araby. Manhattan was where. So I, as I've said, growing up in the Bronx, I might as well have been growing up in the middle of the country, but except that I could take the subway and go downtown and visit every day and then go back home. But yes, it was very much like growing up in a village. Everyone who grows up that way feels that way. You must have exactly the same thing in all the great cities of Spain. You know, young people long to get to the center. And Manhattan was the center and still is. And people, you know, people still grow up in the Bronx, only now they're not what we were. They're not, when I was a kid, they were Jews and Irish and Italians, and you know, now it's a whole different set of immigrants, people growing up. But I grew up and went to City College, the City College of New York, and now the same. I mean, it is still the college of working class kids. Only now my niece teaches at the City College of New York. But City College was a great thing for us. It gave education to thousands of working class people, kids who were set on their way. Yes, so that's what the Bronx was, right?
I think when you went to Manhattan, this lifted your spirits in some ways. Seeing other people who were doing so many things.
Well, Manhattan was the center. It was. It still is. To this day, I walk out in the street and it's filled. The streets are filled with vitality. No matter what happens, the vitality is visceral. You can feel it. I don't think there's another city in the world like it. I could easily never leave New York City for the rest of my life and be perfectly happy.
But we are happy when you come here.
Yeah, okay, and I'm happy to be here.
You can
Madrid is beautiful. I have to tell
time.
you, it's beautiful and sympathetic. I have really enjoyed being here for these few days. Yes.
Last question, and I let you go to the hotel
Okay,
and then
go
rest
sleep.
a little bit. In one of the memoirs, I think you talk about Samuel Johnson and his relationship with London. And loneliness also.
Yes,
and he said that he couldn't feel lonely in a city like London.
That's
and
right.
this happens to you in New York.
Absolutely. That's what the city is for. I mean, the city is for exactly that. For all the people who live alone and all the people who feel alone, regardless of whether they do or they don't. The thing about a great city is that it renews your vitality. It renews your connection to the human race. New York is a city full of street theater. You don't walk 3 blocks that you don't hear 6 things that are amusing or instructive or sobering but make you feel the life within yourself all over again. And as I've also said a number of times earlier here, now 50% of all households in New York City are single-person households. That's an astonishing statistic.
50%.
50, half.
Wow.
Yeah. So imagine all these people living alone and what is needed to cut that, now that solitariness, that living alone, that solitude. Again, it's a double-edged sword. It's good and it's bad. There's great stuff in it. It's extremely useful. It's extremely painful. It's extremely everything. It's an extreme state. And it is ameliorated by joining the crowd in the street. And that, historically, has been the meaning of the city. It is why and how the city developed out of that. And Johnson, who was living in the 1740s, in a city that was full of crime, disease, smoke, and filth, and I mean, it was absolutely disgusting. He loved it. He loved it. He walked by smoking torchlight at midnight through the streets of that city where people are murdering each other in alleyways. And he said, the man who is tired of London is tired of life. And that was true. I mean, it was as true then as it is now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I confirm it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for leaving New York for a few days and come visit us.
Thank you for having
Come
me.
again, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very sweet.